Thanks for being here. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you for joining us. The entire interview will take place in English, except for the question and answer period. Therefore, if you haven't already done so, please get a receiver for the automatic translations available at the front, and hello to our translators.
Sarah Jennings describes herself as a broadcaster, writer, producer, and commentator. She's covered politics, social affairs, and the arts extensively for the BBC, the CBC, the Globe and Mail, National Post, and my personal favorite these days, the Ottawa Citizen. In this context, she's covered all major national cultural organizations and events. She's written, edited, and produced hundreds of documentaries and news programs. Very generously, she shared her knowledge and experience with graduate and undergraduate students at Carleton University's School of Journalism. Ms. Jennings is also a volunteer extraordinaire. The National Arts Center, Elwood School, the Opera Lyra have all benefited from her efforts. And if that was not enough, she's also had a career as a business person, serving as a partner in an urban research and development firm. Ms. Jennings is the first guest in a new series designed to highlight the life and works of exemplary Canadian personalities who've entrusted their personal archives to Librarian Archives Canada. The Sarah Jennings Fond bears the very romantic name of Fond R14484, and it is in some ways atypical. Whereas a fond usually documents the whole life or part of the life of an individual, this fond focuses on documentation related to a research on the history of the National Arts Center. Consists of textual records, digital records, images, and over 191 hours of sound recordings accumulated between 2003 and 2009 by Ms. Jennings in the course of over 100 interviews with individuals associated with the NAC. Must warn you that the audio clips are raw archival material, but they are well worth listening to. As per Ms. Jennings' request, the material held by LAC is entirely accessible to the public as of now. As of the moment you gave it, actually.
It wasn't actually at that moment. It took a little work to get it to that point.
Yeah, I would guess. List of interviewees reads like a who's who of Canadian culture. André Brassard, Robert Lepage, Michel Tremblay, Marty Maradon, Mario Bernardi, Pinchas Zuckerman, as well as ministers Sheila Copps, Francis Fox, Mitchell Sharp, Flora MacDonald, and others. That material is the source of the book Art and Politics, The History of the National Arts Center, which was published in 2009. And if you've read the Hill Times this morning or John's blog, you will know that the new minister, Mélanie Joly, is currently reading your book. So, une fleur pour vous.
Sales should fly.
Ms. Jennings, thank you for accepting my invitation. You had your first experience with archives when you were a freelancer at the BBC, and you've kept very fond memories of that era.
Well, that's absolutely correct, Guy, and I want, first of all, to make a shout-out for Librarian Archives. Without them, writers and researchers couldn't do their work, and I have been one of the lucky ones that from the very beginning had wonderful support whenever I sought out information from either a library or archives. In my experience, there are two kinds of archivists, those who collect and protect and perhaps hoard the material, and those who do all of the above and then make sure that they make it accessible to people like me so that it's used. That's a very important part, and I hope that your team and your staff here and everywhere in the country understands that we need their help when we do this work. But when I was in England as a young freelancer, pitching ideas at the CBC and the BBC, there wasn't anything I could call up on that I couldn't get help with. It could be bats in the belfry, that was my very first story, or it could be something on British trains, or it could be the Salvation Army. And I always was treated with the same courtesy and respect as if I was the host of a program or a big television star or whatever. And the other question, or the other issue, was accessibility. That was extraordinary as I look back at it, that I, as a sort of young person working around England and London, could go to the British Library and I could I could go in and do work. I could go to the Collindale newspaper library, for example, or I could get into the BBC archives. I didn't have to be a scholar or an academic to get access. And that's something very important about library archives in Canada. It is accessible to the general public. And that's one reason why I have waived the copyright on all this material, because I was so lucky in my own early days that I want to make it as easy as possible for students or teachers or other broadcasters or filmmakers who might want to use this material, the recorded material particularly, that they can get at it without complications. So here's to archives, I say, and I'm glad to be here to talk about them.
Thanks. That wasn't rehearsed.
It was.
So you've conducted for your book, which, well, not for the book actually, for your project, over 100 interviews, 191 hours of sound recordings. That's over 5 years of your life.
Oh gosh, I thought.
What was the motivation behind that?
Well, certainly at the outset we had no idea it was going to take 5 years, that's for sure. I think I'm always driven by my passion and love of the arts. This started when I was very young. My parents were very active in the arts in Toronto. My father was a senior programming executive in the CBC, and our house was always full of these interesting people. So as I grew up and went on into a broadcast career, I subsequently, and sort of well on in my career, became the national arts reporter for the CBC out of Ottawa, which meant that I was covering all the national arts organization, cultural organization, the great cultural organizations, including LAC, CRTC, the National Arts, and so on. So when I was at a National Arts Center, New World Order, at the end of the 90s, I'd been on the board. I was asked to be on the board, I must say, by Dr. David Layton, the new chair at that time, who came to me and asked if we might be able to do a history of the Arts Center. And I knew the players, I knew the subject, I was mad about it, obviously. So I agreed that, yeah, that would be a good idea. So before I knew it, we were off and running, but it sort of grew like Topsy. It took on a life of its own. I had no idea that it would become, and neither did Dr. Layton, I must say, that it would become such an enormous undertaking. And again, one of the elements which made this possible for me was that through his good offices and the general operation at the Arts Center, I was given full access to all their records, board meetings, all the recorded materials, all the, documentary materials that existed, but no editorial input. I was just gathering materials. Nobody was trying to tell me where to look or what to look at or who I could talk to, who I couldn't. So in this respect, I was terribly lucky, and that's how it started.
And reading the list, it sounds as though everybody, answered, but without naming names. Did you get to have all the interviews you wanted?
Yes, I would say there's always more that you want to get, and occasionally one lost a good interview. People were aging, and I lost 2 or 3 terribly key people who I would love to have talked to, one of them being Bruce Corder, who was the second in command to Mr. Southam. Mr. Southam, who became the first Director General of the National Arts Centre and was the founder of the project, sort of floated above the fray very often, while Mr. Corder was the bad cop underneath him. So it took me a long time to persuade him to talk to me, and sadly he fell ill literally the day we were to meet. He was taken to hospital. So there were a few I lost. But by and large, I think people were just waiting for somebody to come along and ask what happened to this great organization. It had had wonderful good times, it had slid into bad times, it had had upheavals, it had had an orchestra strike, which is a shocking idea. People just were waiting to tell their story. And if any of you are would-be interviewers out there, the secret of interviewing is just to get people talking and then listen, because people all want to talk and they all want to tell their story, and that applies whether they're a stagehand or whether they're a minister of the crown. If you're prepared to listen to what they have to say, you often hear quite a lot.
So it started out as oral history?
It started out as oral history, that's correct.
And when did you become convinced that there was a book in there?
I'd say about a third of the way through. it began to become intriguing, and I could see the outlines of certain components. And I have to admit that I was heavily influenced by a wonderful book by the British music critic Norman Lebrecht called Covent Garden. It was a history of Covent Garden. And I was riveted by this book. All the same sort of ups and downs, passions, money, no money, people at each other's throats. And Mr. Herrendorf, Peter Herrendorf, who became the CEO and remains so at that time in the late 90s, I lent him a copy of the book. And it came back and it was heavily marked up, pages and, mark this, look at this, watch that. So that book made me realize that, there was a story that could be told here. And once I got into that, there was no turning back. I had to talk to everybody I could lay my hands on.
And again, it started off as the history of the NAC, but in the end, it tells the larger story of the relationship between art and politics. The title says so.
Yes.
So again, did that creep up on you, or did you expect that?
Yes, that's a very good question. As a documentary maker, but the best documentaries always rise up out of the material that you are encountering in your work. If you go in with a preconceived notion and try to fit the foot to the shoe instead of the shoe to the foot, you'll never get the same story. My training was brought up in a time of the first cinema verite in the 60s and so on, so we just followed the story. So it became evident to me as I was reading documents and talking to people and talking to senior public servants and listening to Mr. Southam and starting to meet with cabinet ministers, and also my own background, having followed these stories when they were news stories, made me begin to understand the relationships that allowed things to occur. And these are great national institutions which are crown corporations. They're separate from the government, but they are obviously very dependent on the goodwill or the spirit of the government of the day. And we can perhaps talk a little bit more about that government relationship with these organizations. It's up to you.
Sure. Well, I think our first actually excerpt will be the perfect occasion to do that. So for this conversation, you've chosen 5 excerpts from those lengthy interviews you've conducted. And the first one is from your interview with Hamilton Southam. You've mentioned his name already. He's, I guess, reading your book, he's the individual who was the most influential in the creation of the National Arts Center.
The father of the National Arts Center.
And the very beginning of your book, you quote a letter from him to then Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson. It's dated November 8, 1963, and he asks officially Pearson and his government to consider the creation of a performing arts center. But the story began before that. That letter was at the end of a long process of lobbying and networking, wasn't it?
It certainly was. They had worked furiously to finally come up with something called the Brown Book, which was sort of the manual, the guide, the plan of how to do this project. So by the time it went to the government, it was pretty much, well, pre-talked, just like an interview, you have a pre-interview. They had pretty much in mind what was coming their way. And when it went, they were able to approve it. I am not even sure that Mr. Southam didn't write the memo to cabinet, actually. It would have gone through one of its officials, but that would have certainly had his guiding hand on it, which is a sort of an interesting thought, since he was to be the recipient of whatever came out. The only thing that was important was that personal relationship with the Prime Minister. And let's hear from Mr. Southam, and then I'll comment a little further on that.
Okay. So let's have this excerpt. At this time, the project is approved, and Southam speaks about the meetings of the advisory committees he's created. Their membership draws on the strengths of the art community in Canada, and he's particularly proud of that. So let's run the first excerpt.
And those meetings were the best part of the process. I was meeting with the people who would be using the building, and who were obviously looking forward to that. I think a great deal of enthusiasm came from the dance people, because in Ottawa there had been no theatre in which the National Ballet or the Grand Ballet Canadien could perform properly. As you may remember, the Capitol Theatre, I think, was used for the Toronto Symphony or the Montreal Symphony, although the acoustics were not very good. But there were stages for orchestras, but not for dance companies. There were no fly galleries. There was no possibility of doing the wonderful things with scenery and that are required by dance. I remember Ludmila Chayayev said of the Capitol Theatre, "Dear Hamilton, there were holes in the floor." Anyway.
Ludmila Chayayev being the head of the Grand
Ballet Canadien, yeah. She was to the Grand Ballet Canadien what Celia Franca was to the National Ballet, the founding director. We had them both. In fact, they met on this committee for the first time. A lot of these artists met for the first time on these committees. They came from all over Canada.
So tell me more about the context of that interview.
Well, I think Mr. Southam, who was a very sophisticated and elegant man and had very, very passionate interest in the arts and understood the best in the arts, because he had traveled a great deal and seen a great deal in his life, was determined to do everything first class at the National Arts Centre. And he did ensure that he consulted all the major art figures, who's who of the arts figures in Canada at that time. Many of them, you remember Expo 67 was also underway at the same time, so many of them were already contributing to that exercise, but he was very adept and skillful. One of the great gifts that he gave to Canada was his ability to organize these things and carry them through. So he would invite all the leading figures in theater at that time, the dance figures, as he mentions in this tape, people in music, and he consulted them. You know, he wanted to know if he was going to build an opera hall, what did they want? If they wanted a concert hall, what did they want? He took his design team around the world. They went to Europe. They visited all the major theaters and opera halls to guide his team to produce the best. And what he really wanted to produce was a first-class building. And although I'd like to speak about the budget in a second, which rose when he sold it initially. The idea, when it was adopted by the government in 1963, it was based on a budget of $9 million. Well, as soon as it got going, that budget began to leap. By leaps and bounds, it went 16, 20, 21, and ultimately went to $42 million. And here's where the element of political contact came in. He had a very close personal relationship with Mr. Pearson, the Prime Minister. Mr. Pearson had gone out with his sister at some time in their earlier lives, and he had the ability to pick up the telephone and call the Prime Minister up, which he did. And he, as he described it to me, as Mr. Southam described it to me, he used to call him up and he'd say, "I'm sorry, Prime Minister, but it's going to be 20 millions now." And he said that Mr. Pearson used to always sigh and say, "Oh well, we'll do it anyway." And they did, obviously. And at the end, they arrived 2 years behind schedule, unfortunately. The building opened in 69, not 67, which was the centennial year. Mr. Southam's position was the country had got a first-class building at a bargain price. And I think that's absolutely correct.
So, recipe for success, have direct access to the Prime Minister.
That helps, no doubt.
And tap into the best artists in the country.
Absolutely, absolutely.
That was, your interview happened at the end of his life, was he?
Yes, I'm glad you asked that question. Mr. Southam was in his late 80s when we had these conversations, and you can tell that's in his voice. But he was very, very alert and very much aware of everything that went on. And one of the delightful qualities of this project, one of his sort of credos of life was more is wrought over lunch than men can dream of. So having started off with doing a couple of taped interviews with him, and he wasn't terribly comfortable being interviewed on tape, things sort of shifted over and we started to have luncheons. And he had his own special table at the Rideau Club, so you would turn up and have lunch at the Rideau Club. And then later, as he was getting older, he'd invite you to his house for lunch. So things were always done in an old and very elegant style. So one counted on not only a good lunch, but wonderful conversation. So I benefited, sometimes to the chagrin of my husband, that I was always going out to lunch with Mr. Southam. But it was most agreeable.
The second excerpt you've chosen is from Robert Lepage. So Lepage was named director of French theater of the NAC in '89. So yeah, he was a young man at the time. And he had a very utopian version for a theater. I quote, he wanted to merge this country's talent, whether French or English. So in the excerpt, Lepage speaks precisely about this vision.
And this is something that's very important to understand about the National Arts Centre, I mean, if I have the pretension to say this, is that, symbols, institutions, and all of that incarnate ideas. So if people believe in Canadian unity, you have to have something that incarnates it. From the moment you have an imaginary iron belt that goes from one end of the country to the other, and you say Canada was connected and built, and this is a belt that's holding it together. It looks like an artist's thing, but in people's inconscient collective unconscious,
Collective unconscious, yeah.
consciousness, the country is held together by this thing, which is the railway. Now, of course, for all sorts of reasons and lack of interest from certain governments and privatization of railways and all these things, and the lack of development of a coast-to-coast system and people not believing in train and all that, what happens is that you start dismantling the railway in this part, and then you dismantle that. And people don't know why they're doing that. They're undoing the symbol of that. National Arts Centre, the same thing. It's an incarnation of everything this country has to offer from every part, whether it's the native culture, the English Canadian culture, the French Canadian culture. Everybody is all under one roof, and it's an incarnation or a metaphor for how these people dialogue or don't dialogue, or
it's a microcosm of the country.
Absolutely.
That's what you're saying.
Now that's a little tip on how an interviewer something an interview should never do, which is talk over your subject at the last moment.
So I surely won't do that. Okay, so
it happens.
I don't think Lepage was able to realize his vision. Was it a matter of circumstances, or was there something else?
I think that's completely correct. Robert Lepage, whom we all know as one of the world's greatest creative artists in theater and opera, he was very young when he came to the Arts Centre. He was only 28, rising 29, and probably had no idea of the difficulties that the Centre was going through at that time. We're now talking 80s towards the 90s, where the place was just sliding down cuts, and more cuts. But he had that vision. He had no hang-ups about working with his colleagues in English-speaking Canada. Many of his Quebec colleagues were very reluctant to work with Anglophones. They were very, I would say, insular in Montreal, doing wonderful work. People like Brassard and Tremblay, great artists in their own right. But he was really following in the thinking of his predecessor from the previous generation, Jean Gascon, who had taken his Théâtre de Nouveau Monde theatre company and moved to Stratford to work with the Stratford Theatre Company in a combined productions of Henry V and so on. And Gascon had been severely punished by his own community for that. He never could go back to Montreal. He was considered a traitor to Quebec by having interacted with the English community. So when Lepage came to the Arts Centre, he had that same vision of working with other creative figures, n'importe quelle langue, no matter what language they spoke. And he, I must say, of all the people I've met, not only in the artistic world, but generally, he was perfectly bilingual. He was just in a dream. He could switch from one language to the other. I wouldn't even call it fluent. It was more than that. He had the capacity to think completely in both languages. So he had the ability to work with his colleagues and integrate things. And unfortunately, because of the hard times that the Art Centre was in at that time, there wasn't the money. He thought he would be able to tour Canada with his productions, that he would be able to really build something greater out of these two cultures than what each of them had individually. And it wasn't to be. So although he was able to do some very interesting work at the Art Centre, he worked on a number of his productions that became famous and went on to travel the world, and I'm thinking of Tectonic Plates, and he did some work on Needles and Opium and other works there. It never took root the way he hoped. And apropos that, the plays he tried to present were not very popular with the Ottawa Francophone audience or people who went to Francophone theatre. His predecessor, André Brassard, had been highly successful and I think still holds the record today for the French language numbers at the Art Centre. But Lepage's ideas just didn't catch fire. So the whole thing was, he says now, when I went to speak to him in Quebec City, he said, it was an illusion. I came in with a dream and an idea, and it really was all an illusion. And in a way, he was correct. But he also felt badly that he hadn't been able to do better here, and which is one reason he agreed to talk to me. He said, I always loved the Art Centre. I want to explain what happened. And here's a man who went on to, and is today, one of the greatest theater figures, really, in the world. And there's no question that his period at the Art Centre provided him with a springboard into that world. There's something about the prestige of the Art Centre, the money, the facilities that artists have when they go there, that they're able to practice their craft in a way that they can't if they're a small local theater in Chicoutimi or wherever it happens to be. So the Art Centre served him well in terms of his own career, but he felt badly that he hadn't done more for Canada or for the Art Centre when he had that job.
And while he was here, the CEO was Yvon Desrochers, very controversial figure.
A very, very controversial figure and a very tragic figure in many ways. Mr. Desrochers came to the Art Centre out of a minister's office. He'd been a senior policy advisor for Francis Fox, where I had known him incidentally. I always found him very easy to work with, gave me lots of leaks and scoops for my newscasts. But when he came to the Art Centre, it was as if he was miscast. And he also came at a time when the Art Centre was being horribly squeezed economically. Everything was shrinking. He was expected to fulfill a mandate for which he had no resources. But unfortunately, he also had a very abrasive personality, which rubbed people the wrong way. And he brought in security measures in the building which affronted artists. He put locks on doors. People could no longer walk in and out. And I couldn't go in and say, hi, what's cooking? It was, the whole atmosphere changed. And he made many, many enemies, which stood in the way of his making success. But he did have some good ideas.
Well, one especially very visionary one.
He had one very visionary idea, and it's really remarkable today to think that this started in, what was it, 75, I don't know the year, I can't remember the year, I have to look at my book. It was Yvon Desrochers who had the idea of HD TV for transmitting arts programming to a broader audience. And it's so ironic that 25 years later, the Metropolitan Opera actually got into this business, and Covent Garden also, and all the major theater companies, La Scala, now use this.
West End Theater now.
Yes, exactly. So he had this idea that he would take productions from the Art Centre and they'd beam them into theaters across the country. And he traveled the country widely to try and implant this idea. He went to all the provinces and he got absolutely no traction whatsoever. And incidentally, an arts executive by the name of Peter Herendorf also prepared a study for him at that time. Mr. Herendorf was still in Toronto working with TV Ontario, or I can't remember who he was with at that time, Toronto Life magazine. But his report indicated that people would not leave their homes and go out to a theater to watch a production unless it was a heavyweight boxing match or something of that ilk. So poor Desrochers just simply couldn't get any echo on that. And then there was a political component to this story, which I'm going to tell you also. I don't know how many of you in the audience would recall, but at that time we were moving into the 200-channel universe in television, and there was a movement afoot, and it did become a solid idea that there would be a specific arts channel on this expanded television universe. The CRTC was going to call for licenses for an arts channel, and it was Desrochers' dream, or he moved on from the original HD TV idea to think, well, the NEC should go after the license for this channel and produce arts programming for it. And he did start to aggressively pursue that. And he created a Department of Television at the Arts Center, and I'll speak about that for a moment. But at the same time, he had on his board several ex officio members, which is no longer the case, by the way. But one of these was Sarah Jennings, who was the president of the CBC. And as plans started to evolve, Mr. Jennings became aware that the Arts Center was going to get into the television business, and he took affront, let's put it that way. He decided that really the CBC should be doing the Arts Channel. So as we moved towards the license hearings, there was competition between these organizations, and it was desperate competition because there was very little money in the government to support any of this. So it was dog eat dog, I guess would be fair to say. It became so known in art circles that this struggle was going on that certain figures like Louis Applebaum, the great composer who was now at the Ontario Arts Council, was watching all of this and wrote to them and said, if you people keep rowing about this, it's going to end up badly. Nothing's going to happen. And he turned out to be completely correct. Because when the license hearings were finally held, and the NEC did go forward, there was lots of, you have to read the book to read all the details. Indeed, both the CBC and the National Arts Centre were bypassed, and the Arts Channel went to an entirely different private group. I think it was called Bravo at the time. The names change as we go through. And it was lost for a publicly funded and initiated project, which was a great loss, really, for the arts in Canada. So while there were very, very good ideas in that time, the pressures, the political pressures, the economic pressures, the competition and struggling for power did in a lot of those good ideas.
And if that wasn't enough, then we get the Alexis Yashin affair.
Yes. How many of you are hockey fans in this room? And remember the Yashin affair. One anyway. The Alexis Yashin affair actually occurred in the next sort of initial recovery period of the Arts Centre. After all this debacle, and the Arts Centre was absolutely decimated, the government of the day then said, what are we going to do with this organization? And initially they thought, we'll sell it off. And they contacted David Mirvish, who is probably one of Canada's greatest private impresarios, and said, would he like to buy it? And I interviewed Mr. Mirvish for the book, and he said, I just laughed and said, if they couldn't run it with all the government resources, how am I supposed to do it? So that idea was a complete non-starter. And they went back to the drawing board and appointed a new chairman of the board, Jean Riley, and a new Director General, John Krypton, who was a wonderfully creative private impresario who came in. And at this moment, they were aware that they were not going to get any more money for the government, so they really had to start to think about some private fundraising. And historically, any notion that the Arts Centre should privately fundraise was resisted by all the other arts groups in the country, all the major ones and the minor ones, because it was felt it would be unfair competition, that they'd have all the resources to fundraise, and it would draw resources from others. So anyway, it was felt they had to do something to raise private money, and they hired a fundraiser to help them, a development officer who joined the team. And as he moved about, especially in Ottawa, he ran across the Yashins. Now, as some of you may not remember, Alexis Yashin was then playing as a star player with the Ottawa Senators. And the Yashin family had come from Russia to support their children. They had 2 sons here, Alexei and Dmitry. Dmitry went to Ashby College, and they were all sports professionals. But unlike perhaps Canada, where I don't see too many hockey players at the Art Center, in Russia, you went to the opera, you went to music, and the Yashins used to insist that their sons, when they finished hockey practice, had to turn up. There was a concert at the Art Center, or there was an opera. So I'd actually met them in the foyer of the Art Center at a performance, because that was part of their life. This is a long story, I'm sorry about it. But in any event, the fundraiser tapped into this, and Yashin was in the process of negotiating his next contract with the Senators, and the owners took a dim view that he was asking so much money, and he had a PR problem with the public. This is seen as a sort of blue-collar public here, and this guy was asking for all this money. So the idea was dreamed up that he'd win favor with the public and help the Art Center by making a major donation. And indeed, that's exactly what was cooked up. And the donation was $1 million, which was colossal at that time, and certainly very, very big today.
Over 5 years.
That is correct. As, by the way, many of these major donations are not a $1 million check.
Course.
It's very often spaced out, although the public doesn't always know that, including me, by the way. In any event, it was rushed into print. The announcement was made. There was a huge event at the National Arts Center. Perhaps some people in the room were there. There was a colossal check, a mock check for $1 million. Minister Copps came down. Everybody put senators' sweaters on. It was a glorious day for arts and culture and hockey in Ottawa. Well, there was one small hiccup, and that was that the paperwork had not been done correctly. It is possible to do these donations. They're normally done through some sort of foundation or instrument, but in order to get a tax receipt, it must be done correctly. And as things unfolded, it turned out that the paperwork had not been done correctly. It takes about 6 months to do these things, to get them into the starting gate even, before the revenue agency agrees to them or not. And none of this work had been done by these newcomers, slight amateurs in the private fundraising world that were now coming into the Art Center. So it was a very tragic tale in the end, because there was bad news around it. The Yashins began to think they were being accused of using the system, that they were being accused of being dishonest. So they became rapidly disaffected, and disinfected, and things collapsed. And the whole thing crashed again, which was a great blow to this, re-emerging art center. Was coming up like a phoenix out of the ashes. It hit this roadblock and had another tumble. So it was a very, very bad time with the new hopes raised to have them dashed in this way. And indeed, while they did get the first $250,000, the gift was canceled, and they didn't get the other $750,000, which was too bad.
And the PR around it is terrible.
Was terrible, and led to, sadly, the resignation of Mr. Krypton and total disillusionment within the staff. So that's why when we hear from the next speaker, which I'll let you introduce, Guy, why the morale of the artistic people in the organization had been so affected by the machinations of the boards that had been running the show and the management of the Arts Center.
So the plays is at 6s and 7s, and 2 new men arrive on the scene, David Layton, and of course the other Peter Erndorf. So under their direction, the NAC again found friends at the center. That was kind of a full circle back to the days of Hamilton Southam. The chapter of your book devoted to these 2 men is most appropriately called The Road to Recovery. In the sound clip you've chosen to illustrate Dr. Layton's role, he speaks about Mitchell Sharp, former Minister of Finance under Pearson, and the role he played in securing a commitment from the government that would not interfere in the naming of members of the board of the NAC. So let's listen to the excerpt.
Well, the biggest one was over board appointments, because as you know, I made the deal with Sheila Copps and extracted a letter, which incidentally Mitchell, this was all done through Mitchell to Sheila. I never dealt directly with Sheila. I said to Mitchell when he approached me for the job that I would accept it only if I had in writing some sort of guarantee that we would be able to have responsibility for building a strong board, that the board would have some input into it all. And that was the key requirement. And Mitchell said, well, why don't you draft out a letter? Which I did. And I sent it up to him, and he took it presumably to Sheila. And I got a phone call from Sheila in my home in London, and she said, well, I'm being asked to sign this letter that you've given me for it. And she said, I have no particular argument with the points you're making there, but she said, I've been in politics for a long time, and I know you never write a letter, you never put this in writing. And I said, well, with respect, Madam Minister, I've been in business a long time, and yet I've learned you always get it in writing. And she had the very good grace to laugh, and she said, touche, you make a point. And she said, after a little discussion, she said, I'll sign it. And she signed it and sent it to me. And that has been a kind of mainstay. Now, that was through Mitchell. Mitchell had vetted that letter, helped me with the routing of it to her, and so he was a kind of shadowy figure in the middle of all of this.
So Sheila, of course, is Minister Sheila Copps.
And Mitchell is Mitchell Sharp.
Of course. And so my question, was that upheld, that commitment? Did it hold for over the following years?
Nope. Sure enough, one day Dr. Layton gets a call from the Prime Minister's office that they've appointed a new person to the board, no consultation, and he's aghast. And once again, he calls up Mitchell Sharp. And here we come again. It's not quite the same as Mr. Southam being able to phone Mr. Pearson, but here's a case where you always need to have a friend at court, somebody you can call in an informal way before things get into a kind of formal ding-dong match. And Mitchell Sharp was that man. If some of you may recall, he'd been a Minister of Finance in Mr. Trudeau's government, but by now he was $1 a year man for Mr. Chrétien. He was well into his 80s at this time. But he was the kind of, he loved music, he was very involved in the Arts Centre, he'd been involved earlier with some of his difficulties, but now he was the contact into the power structure. And Mr. Layton, Dr. Layton, called him up and said, this has happened and I'm afraid I'm going to resign. And Mr. Sharp said, don't resign, wait a second, let me call. And he did. And a day later, Dr. Layton got a phone call again from Mr. Sharp saying, hang on, you're going to get a call from the Prime Minister. So Dr. Layton went home to London, Ontario, and sure enough, the phone rings, and it's Mr. Chrétien on the telephone. Hello, David, we goofed. And those were his literal words, we goofed. And Dr. Layton laughed and always liked Mr. Chrétien very much. And so back and forth they went, and he said, but it's an order in council appointment. How are you going to change it? And Mr. Chrétien said, don't worry, we'll find another place for this person. Don't worry. And sure enough, they switched it. About a week or two later, another name is put forward. This one comes to Dr. Layton, and it's a man by the name of Louis Lagacé, who was a Montreal-based individual, but who happened to have got his MBA from the Western University School of Business, which is Dr. Layton's home school and where he was a senior professor. Went through like a charm, no problem at all. But that was the one time that Dr. Layton had to call in that chip, and it paid off, and it was very important. Dr. Layton was a very skilled and knowledgeable management expert, and the sort of key power behind the throne with the new management that came to the Arts Centre in getting the management processes straightened around and working efficiently. So, it was very important that correct board appointments were made that would help the organization instead of just being rewards for political favors. So that was a very important step in the life of the Arts Center.
So just to make sure that we get to hear all the excerpts, we're going to quickly go to Marty Marden, hired in 1997, head of the English Theatre program, and she, here in this excerpt, she discusses the importance of the Board of Trustees.
Absolutely needed. It's terribly important that the chair of the board of this organization be a proper appointment and not a political favor or a kind of patronage kind of appointment. So I think that is critical to the health of this institution, and I think David Layton did a great deal to make it extremely clear about how chair should be appointed. Also, it is my distinct impression, although there were many distinguished people on that board when I was first here, that the board got stronger because there were people who truly loved and advocated for the arts and were not just, and this is the impression we all had, watchdogs for the organization and there to hire and fire CEOs. And that's what it felt like. All I do know is that as the board grew, there were more and more people who were proactive and went beyond being the watchdog category.
So your impression is that the Board of Trustees is now more important than it ever was?
I think absolutely correct. Times have changed enormously since the days of Hamilton Southam, and a small coterie of people who could be counted on to look after national interests. Now these board members come from across the country and generally have knowledge of the arts world that they're being asked to connect. They know their regions. They know, since the Arts Centre, we can talk about this further, has now got into the private fundraising business, they need to know how to connect in those regions. So these appointments are very, very important. And they have to be extremely proactive in terms of supporting the arts nationally in the country. So yes, I would say the role of the board is more important than it's ever been historically, and its appointments are extremely important.
So our last excerpt is from Peter Erndorf, current president and CEO of the institution, and his perception at the time of the fact that art and culture no longer play as important a role as they once did. So,
just before you play that,
in Pearson's
sorry,
it's my fault. I interrupted again. The important thing about the Arts Centre, which doesn't apply to any other of our national cultural organizations, is that the CEO of this organization is appointed by the board, not by the government of the day. So it gives it a great deal more arm's length from the government. And in the appointment of Peter Erndorf, the selection committee for the board of the National Arts Centre made a wonderful choice. Now I'll let you go. Sorry.
I think in Pearson's time and in Trudeau's time and some other periods, there was a lot of debate about the role of culture in the life of the country, in the role of the arts in the cultural landscape, all of those kinds of things. These were heady conversations. I see far less preoccupation with those kinds of issues today. And so rather than seeing them politicized, I think the preoccupation has moved to other things. The preoccupation is with our role in the world. It's with competitiveness. It's with you name it. And this to me is no longer at the center of the debate here or in the country. And the question is how people who care about these things can go back to that.
So those words were spoken 5-6 years ago.
Correct.
How would you describe the relationship between art and politics today?
Well, in terms of the Arts Centre, or all right, I think that, as I said at the beginning of this session, that the health of the arts is not entirely dependent, but certainly is affected by the goodwill or lack of same by the government of the day. Artists will do their work regardless whether they're arrested and have to go underground or whatever, but it certainly helps when you have a public life which is well disposed to the arts. And Mr. Herndorf's point is that perhaps discussion of cultural matters is no longer one of the central debates in Canada, but he's very keen to try and move it up the agenda and get it back into people's consciousness. And through his leadership at the Arts Centre, they have gone about it in a very, very interesting way. And I think it might be capitalized in the term, by their deeds you will know them. For example, shortly after he arrived, they started a series of scenes. Now these are biannual, every 2-year festivals from a particular region of the country. So you'd have artists from Ontario. The first one was from Atlantic provinces, actually. And then they did Alberta. And they used that tool to not only bring artists of every persuasion, visual artists, theater, music, cooking, in a sort of a blast festival for Ottawa for a couple of weeks every 2 years from this region or that region, but that also allows them to engage the members of parliament from that region, from prominent figures from those regions. I remember when the Alberta scene came to town, the former Premier Peter Lougheed and his wife became the team leaders, champion. They came to town, they went to every event. I kept bumping into them. Wherever you went around town, there was Peter Lougheed, who was a very prominent figure in Canadian political life. And his way of describing it was like if your team was coming to town for the Grey Cup, you came down and you supported. So gradually the Arts Centre has got its identity out into the regions in a very effective way, and then also in touring the orchestra. They don't just tour the orchestra, they take a whole series of outreach programs with them, educational programs. The musicians go out and work in the community. They connect on the ground with local people. So there's a tremendous amount of goodwill and information generated. And then new media is, taking the product out around the country, certainly on the internet. And I know that the NEC Arts Alive page is one of the most watched, or hit, do they say in internet language, services in the world now. People tune in to get music broadcasts and so on. So the National Arts Centre is reconnecting nationally in a different manner than it did in its day under Mr. Southam, where people came to the national stage in Ottawa. The only people for whom this is a little bit different, in my opinion, and that is with the artists themselves. And there were many, many discussions over the years, how should the Arts Centre decentralize, et cetera, et cetera. And I always used to interview artists on this question when they came to Ottawa. And really, to a man, they wanted to retain this sense of a national stage. They loved coming, and do love coming to perform here. And one of the reasons, it's a wonderful hall, whether it's theater or music, to perform in. The facilities, thanks to Mr. Southam, are first class in every respect. The theater crews are tops. Artists love to come and play at the Arts Centre, but there's also that sense that when they do come here, it is a sense that they have arrived, that this is a national stage. And I'm always struck by that. The greatest artists, Ben Heppner, Maureen Forrester when she was alive, Colm Fiore now coming, they're proud and happy to give their services to the Arts Centre because it does represent something in our psyche, just as Lepage was saying. So this is where obviously my passion comes from, and why the arts, I think, will flourish and grow, and thanks to this organization.
Well, thank you for a fascinating conversation.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now you should applaud.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And not only applause, but buy the book.
Yes,
Arts and Politics is available. It's on sale here, thanks to our friends at Books on Beechwood. Our next rendezvous is Tuesday, March 8th. Same time, same place. I'll be in conversation with author Jacques Godbout.
Novelist, critic, columnist, Godbout is known as being the first witness of the Quiet Revolution.
And one final announcement. On Thursday, January 18th, so it's this week, 3:30 p.m. here, 395 Wellington. The Honorable Patricia Idu, the new Minister for the Status of Women, will be one of our 3 guest speakers. She will be presenting on 100 years in the struggle for women's rights. So thank you, have a nice afternoon, and see you on March 8th.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Steve.